Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today we're welcoming Mark Elsdon to the show. Mark lives and works at the intersection of money and meaning as an entrepreneur, nonprofit executive, author, and speaker. He is the author of We Aren't Broke, about the use of faith-based property and investments for social enterprise and investing. Mark's new book, Gone for Good, Negotiating the Coming Wave of Church Property Transition, comes out in January 24 and is available for pre-order. Mark is a co-founder of RootedGood, which supports catalytic and innovative church leaders working on property development, Money and Mission Alliance, and social enterprise. He's the executive director at Press House and Press House Apartments on the University of Wisconsin's Madison campus. He's principal at Threshold Sacred Development and past president of the board of directors for Working Capital for Community Needs, an impact investing fund that provides microfinance funding for the working poor in Latin America. Mark has a BA in psychology from the University of California, Berkeley, a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, and an MBA from the University of Wisconsin School of Business. He is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA and lives in Madison, Wisconsin. Mark is an avid cyclist and considers it a good year when he rides more miles on his bike than he drives in his car. Let's welcome Mark to the show. All right, welcome to the show, Mark Elsdon. Thanks so much for being here. Anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
Well, my bio ends with a reference to riding my bike, which is, if anyone knows me well, the sort of defining thing about what I do with my time. And it is winter in Wisconsin at the moment, so I am preparing to ride in the snow. So you can keep that in mind if you're in a warmer climate.
Well, it looks like if that's a real window behind you, it looks like you got blue skies today. So
we do
riding home,
blue skies, but it is cold, and I'm riding my bike home later. Yes.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you how that's going, the bike mileage versus the car mileage.
It's going. I think I've got it again this year. So yeah,
that's very impressive.
More bike mileage than car mileage. Yeah,
that's very impressive. Well, thanks so much for your time, and looking forward to having this conversation. Share, if you would. You've been on the pod before, but share, if you would, just about kind of your faith journey, what that looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Presbyterian minister. I grew up. My parents are immigrants from England. They were grew up Church of England, and then I grew up going to a Lutheran church. I actually open my new book, Gone for Good, with a whole series of stories of ways that different churches shaped me over the years. Everything from giving me my family name in Northern England to a place where I would hide out and play basketball instead of going on long runs during cross-country practice in high school, to meeting my spouse, serving at a meal for food insecure people in Berkeley, California, and all these other stories of way churches have shaped me. And so, I'm very conscious of the ways that I am who I am because of the connections I've had to faith communities over the years.
Awesome. What's a spiritual practice that you'd say is sustaining you right now?
Yeah, I in addition to riding my bike and as sort of an active prayer and an active sort of communal living, I recently got a dog. I think you have a dog, but I recently got a dog, and walking my dog in the neighborhood has become a really nice spiritual practice. Just, a chance to take a break. Days that I work from home, I like to just get out for a little brief walk after lunch and just to pause. I've been really trying to focus on that sort of Sabbath act, even if I do like to take a full Sabbath day, but sometimes it's just a Sabbath act in the middle of a day is as powerful as anything. So I've been enjoying that.
Yeah, I'll be doing that when we're done here. So recommend.
Well, the dog doesn't let you kind of my dog at least doesn't let me sort of run around the block. He likes to poke around and take his time and smell everything, and that forces you to slow down. There's something powerful about that.
Yep. Good. Well, as Mark hinted at, we're talking about his new book and called Gone for Good. And Mark, you have to tell us as we're recording this, is this available yet for purchase? I imagine when this releases, it maybe. When is it coming out? How about that?
The book comes out January 9th. So it is available for pre-order now, and any pre-orders before that ship, I think, on the 9th. But January 9th is, I actually have the book here, my copy of it, but it's available to the public January 9th.
Great. So when this releases, it should be available for folks. So check it out at minimum if this comes out early for pre-order. But we're going to kind of talk through a little teaser video that Mark highlighted on his website, kind of talking about the book and talk through some themes here. So the first thing in this video you shared, and Mark, I'll try to make sure that's included in the show notes just so folks get that same video. But the first thing that jumped out to me when I watched that is you share a statistic that an estimated 100,000 buildings, and again, I want to say that number, 100,000 buildings will be sold or repurposed by 2030.
Mm-hmm.
So that number kind of astounds me. So do you want to talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the first thing to note is that these are estimates. There's really no really clear data out there.
Sure.
Even most denominations don't even know how many buildings are associated with their denomination. And so, but the estimates that a number of different people have made on this issue are somewhere in that range of 100,000 churches closing or buildings being sold or repurposed, sort of. Those aren't exactly the same thing, but but they're connected, and that amounts to a third or a quarter of all churches in the United States.
Wow,
it's a huge number, right? So that's the reason the book references the coming wave of church property transition, and it really is a massive wave that's going to crash upon the shores of American Christianity in the next decade. Now, this doesn't mean all churches are going to close and all buildings are going to be sold, and new churches will still happen and emerge, and plants will happen, and some churches will continue to grow. All of that, that's all true. God's not going anywhere.
Right.
But there's a massive change happening in the way people connect with God and engage in their faith, and that's translating into a different use of buildings and property. I've actually been thinking about this a little bit recently in terms of kind of the Blockbuster video moment that we had in the early 2000s where, there was a shift from going down to the Blockbuster store and renting a video off the shelf, taking it home, returning it 3 days later. And suddenly we were getting our DVDs in the mail through Netflix. And then it wasn't very long after that we were just streaming them. And people still want the experience of watching a movie. They still want to watch a movie, but the spaces, the physical spaces where they access those movies just change dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something similar going on in people's spiritual life. They still want, I believe, experiences of the divine. They want to connect with God. They want to connect with meaning, with each other, with purpose. But it's not happening as much in Sunday morning worship services and Sunday school Christian education classes, which is what we built for.
Right.
For decades and decades, we built buildings for those things. And so, but just kind of berating ourselves for that is not particularly helpful. It'd be like telling the Blockbuster video store manager that they just need to try harder and put a new sign outside.
Right.
And, kind of just do something better. And then people will come back into the store. Would never have happened. It doesn't matter how much they tried, right? And there's a bit of that dynamic going on in the church today. It's just a change in the way people are connecting with God. And again, not everyone. There's always going to be worship, corporate worship, and there will be good Sunday school classes and all of that. And there will be traditional church buildings and experiences, but just not as much of it as we had in the past.
Yeah, if I can stay on that Blockbuster video theme for a second. My wife and I went to look at renting a new movie streaming on Amazon. It was like $10. And I was kind of like, a new video release at Blockbuster wasn't even like $5 back in the day. So I don't know what that's about. And there's far less overhead. Anyway, I digress there. So I think a key question, if I remember correctly, you ask in the video is what will be left and how will it affect communities and neighborhoods? So you've obviously given a lot of thought to this. I imagine the book really tackles these questions. Do you want to share some thoughts you've had and some of your contributors have had?
Yeah. So, one of the questions I have is not only what does this mean for the church or church-going people, which is obviously significant, but what does it mean for the social infrastructure of communities, right? The spaces where things happen, like where will the Girl Scout troop meet? And where will the AA groups meet? I mean, loads of AA groups meet in churches. Where will we vote? In my community, voting happens at churches all over the city. If those churches are something else in 10 years, where are we going to vote? Where will people pick up food at the food pantry? Where will they meet significant others? And where will kids' violin lessons practice? I mean, there's just endless things that happen in churches in addition to the spiritual life that is going to be missing. And I don't think we fully sort of recognize that reality of where all that space is going and what it becomes. And that concerns me, and especially if that space moves from being a socially oriented space to being basically privately owned, and monetized by largely wealthy people, investors, developers, and so on. Then we've lost a lot. We've lost a lot of social infrastructure with that change in use. And I think that's a big deal. I think it's going to really impact communities in ways that we don't fully fathom yet if we just let that happen all over the place.
Let me give an example, just because I just saw something while I was eating lunch on Threads. In my metro area, there's an old Baptist church in a neighborhood that I actually lived in when I was a teenager in Denver. And I think they tore down part of the church and built condos. And then the real historic part of the sanctuary, once you know, it was a brewery. And now that brewery is actually closing. So again, there's this question of what's going to happen to that space. And of course, because I'm totally a church nerd, I said, hey, like make it a church again. Unlikely to happen. Someone else said it's probably going to become a dispensary, but it kind of speaks to your point there of these public spaces becoming less and less accessible to the public. And I think that's certainly a dynamic that I've noticed is this kind of privatization of space where you have to essentially pay to get anywhere. I'm sure you've noticed this too, and others have talked about, like, public libraries are one of the few kind of public spaces available in many communities, and they themselves are being underfunded, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, the Partners for Sacred Places, who has a couple chapters in the book, they did a study on the halo effect of churches, and one of the amazing things they found was that in one area that they studied, I think it was 87% of visits to the churches in that community had nothing to do with worship.
Wow.
It was just community activity that was going on, right? And I mean, in my view, that's part of what it means to be the church. Obviously, worship is central, but also these other things are too. I mean, that's how Christian life is lived out in the world, in my view, right? It's through that sort of stuff. And so, the privatization and the kind of closing off of space. And again, if it happens once or twice in a neighborhood or in a city, that's one thing. But when it happens with 40 out of 100,
right,
that's a completely different story, right? So if one church building becomes high-end condos, all right, maybe that's not a huge deal. But again, if 25, 30, 40% of them in a city do, then you've got a real change going on. And as you noted, it's not going back.
Right.
Once those are no longer churches and they're owned privately, they're not going to be churches again, and not in any foreseeable future. I mean, who knows? Obviously, things may change and religious life in America might look really different in 100 years. But in our sort of lifetime and vision, it's not going back to being a church. So we have kind of one chance to transition these properties. They're going to change one way or the other. It doesn't matter whether we want them to or not. They are going to, sort of like Blockbuster. But the question before us is, what are we going to do about that? And how do we sort of intentionally think about those transitions in a way that leaves good in their place? That's why I titled the book Gone for Good.
Yeah.
Gone for good, as in something good coming out, or are they gone forever?
Yeah, the double meaning. I love it.
Yeah.
So there's a church that I shouldn't name names here, so I won't. There's a church in my neck of the woods that is open right now, and have a aspiration of becoming their pastor, because my thought is long term, like one way or another, that property is going to become condos. Like they can either develop it thoughtfully and intentionally in some capacity, or it's just going to get turned into all condos one way or another. So you propose what you say, thoughtful intervention. So talk about what that might look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm suggesting is that we shape this transition rather than letting it just shape us. Because I think if we just let it unfold, we're going to be unhappy with the outcome when we look back, say, 20 years from now. I mean, if market forces are all that drive, they will push us towards financial outcomes and not spiritual or social outcomes that, are about flourishing of neighborhoods. So in my view, thoughtful intervention is the act of intentionally seeking good in our community with the use of property, not just disposing of it, monetizing it, or walking away from it, which is very often what happens in the end. And so, yeah, it's exactly what you described. Is that property you're describing and thinking of it's going to look different. There's just no question about it. So what is the looking different going to be, right? And if it's going to be housing, that could be really cool. But what kind of housing? Who's going to own the housing? Where's the money going when that housing is done? Who's going to live in that housing? Is that going to contribute to flourishing in that neighborhood, or is it going to just further gentrify the neighborhood in some way? Or, those are all the sorts of questions that we as the church have a chance to decide now, and we won't have a chance to decide later. I mean, once a property is sold or redone, that's it. Like we're out of that opportunity to influence what will happen there.
I appreciate what you're saying about the gone, the kind of the play on words, gone for good or gone for, contributing good. Because one pastor I've spoken to, he really lamented this idea, like, we're never getting back these kind of downtown, really core locations that were really vital parts of the community. So what do you tell churches or middle judicatories? What kind of wisdom or thoughts do you ask them to consider before, they sell a property, even if it's just because of the location, for instance?
Yeah. So RootedGood, one of the organizations I work with, we actually designed a guide how to sell well, which is all about, it sort of takes people through this decision-making process. And it's exactly that, right? It's thinking about, first of all, are there alternatives to selling? Because there are many times alternatives to selling. I often will ask people simply, why not give it away? Give it away to a different church community that can use it, or give the land back to indigenous peoples that lived there before as an act of restoration. If we're not using it anyways, I'd rather see that happen potentially than sort of monetizing
just
it
a cash
for
cow.
private.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So, or could we do social enterprise on it? Or could we partner in some way and develop at least some housing or something or other that is, contributes to the neighborhood? And, there's lots of different alternatives. But if you are going to sell it, then there's questions around what are you going to do with the proceeds of that money? Because there's better and not better things we can do with the money when it comes in, right? And who are we selling it to? Because again, you have one chance to decide who to sell it to.
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to selling, but I will say that I think that is a cautionary, word, and that we won't get them back. So I'm also the pastor at Press House, the Presbyterian Campus Center at University of Wisconsin. And our story is super interesting because there were 3 campus ministry centers, Presbyterian, sold about the same time or attempted to be sold in the late 1990s. Our synod sold the campus center at the University of Minnesota and at the University of Iowa, and they tried to sell the one here at the University of Wisconsin. But local people in Madison resisted that sale and instead held on to it, and we redeveloped the property. We have student housing on the property. And now fast forward 20 years, there's no active Presbyterian ministry at the University of Minnesota or Iowa.
Yeah.
There's no property at those schools. The money that was gained is basically gone.
Yeah.
Here in Wisconsin, we serve 1,000 students a year through our ministry. Our property's worth like $25 million, and we generate $2.5 million a year in revenue. It's like a completely different outcome.
Right.
It's so starkly different because we decided to do something different than just dispose of it. Now, again, there is too much property churches own. We will have to dispose of in some way, but we can influence the way that is done and what ends up going in there at those moments, at those key moments. Yeah.
So we've kind of been talking around this, and I want to ask this directly. How about the loss of sacred space? I'm a big believer, I'll say, in sacred space. And to me, at least, there's something that, as much as I understand the practicalities of like a multi-function worship space, I also, having been someone who's worshiped in a elementary school gymnasium, like know what the downsides of that are. So talk about, what do you think about the loss of sacred space, or why, or does sacred space matter in these contexts?
Yeah, it does. I think you're absolutely right. I believe God's present in all circumstances and all places, not only church or worship, but there is sort of a special promise that God meets us in sacred spaces and sacred practices, like the sacraments and spaces that are set aside for us to pause, to put aside the normal activity of life, to think differently. And space does that, right? When you enter into well-designed space or intentional space, it changes the way we think. And I think we need that. We need those transitional experiences to allow us to encounter God in different ways. So absolutely, there is something really valuable about sacred space. And there is something sad about seeing a lot of sacred space in the United States decline, and not just the church's decline, but the space itself.
Right.
Deferred maintenance and things that they leak, they've got issues, right? And but that is the way things go. Things age, things change, I absolutely think there is a place for sacred space. I think what we're doing now, or thinking about now, is how does that get sort of re-envisioned, right, as part of these multi-use projects if they're being redeveloped? And how does it get right-sized a little bit? Do we need maybe as much sacred space? Maybe not.
Yeah.
Right. But we still need it, for sure. Yeah.
This is a related question. And I'm thinking about this in the context of, again, like the prevalence of like multi-purpose space. And it seems like we're really, as a society, like thinking, unless you're an NFL team, right, then you get your own dedicated stadium for $5 billion. But in most other contexts, it's multi-use, multi-purpose, multi-everything. And I think about, and I may be wrong in this, but my thought is that that kind of thinking has crept its way into the church, and that a church has got to kind of prove its value to the community through multi-usage. And I'm curious, this is kind of a big theological question, like, is a church building or a space in the church existing only for worship and faith formation? Like, is that enough? And I know that's a loaded question, but I'm kind of curious your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think it is enough. I don't think we have to have something beyond that. I think that is perfectly acceptable as a use of space. I think there's a couple of responses I have to that. One is, yes, it is enough, but again, there's too much of it
Mm.
for how it's more a matter of scale and sort of use and size than it is like purpose in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just too much of that only space.
Sure.
Right, for the number of people using it in that way.
Yeah.
And for what it can do in a community. So that's one sort of thought there. And then the other is, I do think I like to think a bit beyond sort of the divide between sacred and, worship and faith formation and in other activities.
Mm-hmm.
So, in my view, giving church land back to indigenous peoples that were there before the church, that's an act of worship.
Mm-hmm.
And, if that space is more than we need, then it's an act of worship to do that. Or turning an unused Christian education wing into like a social entrepreneur incubator space.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as if worship's not enough, but doing that is an act of faith formation, or it can be.
Mm-hmm.
Providing long-term, housing at cost people can afford is a way of living out our faith commitments of justice and loving our neighbors. So I would frame a lot of those activities as expressions of our worship life and our faith life, if they're done sort of well, right? So it's a combination of of a bit of right sizing of the amount of that space, and then also of thinking about different ways to engage with people. And I work with young people, and they are very interested in what does it mean to live out faith in the day to day and not just in Sunday.
Right.
And these are ways of doing that.
Yeah.
But I would never say that it's not enough to have, worship in a space is not enough. It is enough. But there's also at the same time, there's also other expressions that space can be used for. So kind of both.
Yeah. That's a helpful response. Let me ask this too, and this is more a practical question that's maybe not so much for churches that are thinking about selling or repurposing to something non-church related, but this is a dynamic that I've seen that I'm curious how you would counsel churches. Is I think there can be a bit of this, what I'll call like a tail wagging the dog scenario, where again, from my bias, like I believe the purpose of a church, first and foremost, purpose is worship and faith formation, right? So that's my bias, at least. Where I've seen these dynamics where you get rental space or childcare, whatever, and these kind of other revenue streams that can support the mission and ministry of the church kind of become almost a tail wagging the dog scenario, at least from my perspective. So I'm kind of curious, like, how would you I don't know, counsel churches like if they're like, hey, we're gonna develop like y'all did, like we're gonna develop a living situation, residences on our property. How do we organize it? How do we do it in a way that we're really living out of our mission and our ministry?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple different directions that can take. So sometimes for churches, the wise approach is to sort of make use of land and buildings simply differently for the good of their community. And that might involve a partnership with somebody to develop, housing or something like that. And they might continue their worship life in a smaller part of that, right? That just, again, it's sort of like fitting down the size a bit,
right,
and using that excess, for other things. I mean, there's a statistic that most churches, even before the COVID pandemic, were only in use like 17% of the week.
Right.
Like pretty poor utilization of a really valuable resource, right? And if a church is interested in doing social enterprise or sort of development that really is connected directly to them and their mission, then we always encourage them to think about who they are and who their neighborhood is and how those things connect. So RootedGood offers a Good Futures Accelerator program that is designed for churches. It's about a 7-month program that churches go through to think about using their buildings and land for social enterprise, for exactly what you're describing, but to do it really thoughtfully, not just to be like, hey, I read an article about X, let's do that.
Yeah.
But to start all the way back with who are we? Who has God called us to be over time? What connects to our congregation deeply? The projects I've seen that are most interesting are the ones where it's tied in with some historical legacy the church is interested in or has been a part of. So like taking a really powerful food pantry ministry and then expanding it and turning that into a grocery co-op owned by the neighborhood. So you turn like this sort of beloved 30, 40, 50-year ministry into something that's got a new version of that, but it's still tied in with something historic and something that's like deeply rooted in who that church is and who the neighborhood is. Not just picking some idea off the shelf and innovating for innovation's sake, but really trying to ground it in something more meaningful and deeper.
And I know this was a throwaway comment that you weren't meaning, but I'm thinking like, or not just like leasing office space to X/Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, so we actually have a tool about how to rent well too.
Yeah.
RootedGood has another guide about how to rent well, and we talk about that sort of dynamic of the money and mission alignment, like and there are sometimes we're just maybe renting for money's sake to support other parts of mission makes sense, but only doing that intentionally and knowing that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
But you're right, and not doing it in a way that sort of undermines your mission,
right?
What you're trying to accomplish. So, absolutely, the more we can align money and mission, the better. Yeah.
What do you think that? And this is kind of a 3-part question. So if you want to answer all of it or just take one aspect, what do you think that churches or pastors or middle judicatories can do to prepare? Maybe that's too big of a question. Like maybe what are some warning signs? Feel free to answer this how you think is best.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a few things I would suggest. One is I think we need to be real about where it's going. I think that, to not sort of hide or assume. I think sometimes will bluntly say in many settings we're way past the point of sort of talking about revitalization of all of these places. I love revitalization.
Right.
There's nothing that's great, but in many settings we're past that point, and we need to be real about, okay, that's not going to happen in this particular instance. So then what? So be real about it. And then do it earlier than later. The other thing we're seeing that's really a struggle is when churches wait too long. And there's not many people left to make any good decisions.
Yeah.
And then they have no choice but to sort of just stick a for sale sign out in the front yard and sell it. It takes years, and especially if you're going to do development, many years, 3, 5, 7, 10, sometimes years to do a good, thoughtful development.
Property development, right?
Yeah. And so you can't just sort of say, well, we're going to run out of money next December and then let's do something about it now. It's too late at that point. Right. So, I think thinking ahead is really important. And there are, I'd say there are expert resources like the, RootedGood. Our accelerator program is super helpful. It really works. 26 churches went through a pilot, and all of the ones that finished found it, 90% found it helpful. And basically all of them have started some new venture of some kind, sometimes quite simple, and small relative. And then some of them are doing big development projects and everything in between. And so there are resources out there, I think, that are helping churches and judicatories help churches to think differently about this stuff. And then ultimately, I'd say just let's hold on to hope. I mean, for me, this is actually a hopeful moment. There's a lot of kind of like, oh gosh, it's closing. It's whatever. And yeah, there's sadness for sure, in the same way that when our beloveds die, and we are sad about that. But at least I believe we're a faith of resurrection and new life. And there's hopefulness and new expressions of what it means to be the Christian church that are emerging. And so just holding tightly to that as we navigate this coming decade, I think, is going to be really important.
Yeah, I appreciate that word about not waiting too long, because I'm imagining, the kind of stereotypical church where they've got 9 people left who are all over 80. Like, God bless those people. I'm sure they're dedicated and love their church, but they're probably not going to have the energy right or the passion to really go do a big undertaking. So that's very helpful to think about. Like, so what does that do? I imagine I'm giving you a chance, I guess, to plug your company here. Is that one of the things y'all try to do, is really work through some strategic planning with churches, and say, hey, if we get in this kind of financial pinch, or our attendance numbers look like this, or we really like feel like this is what God is calling us to, like, how does that work with churches? If that's something you do, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, not exactly what you described, but like I said, I mean, the accelerator program that we have is designed for churches to do on their own.
Okay.
They get a box sent to them in the mail with all the guides they need and all these beautiful table sheets and some games and gamified activities for their leadership team and for the congregation to do. And then they access some video content, and they work through this process together that leads them to some ideas about what to actually do, some actual ideas around social enterprise. And again, it's not sort of a general revitalization curriculum or a general Bible study curriculum, but it's really focused on, okay, we have these assets, this building, this land. We have vision of maybe some ideas, maybe not. And we have people that live around us and that work around us. And what can we do to put forward new expressions of our ministry in the world through these resources? And it works. People do it, and it works. And so, we're really excited about that because we think there's a lot of potential for that. To move folks forward. They'll still need to find partners when they get through the other side on that, some of that stuff, especially if you're developing property.
Yeah.
You can't do that on your own. But we've seen so many churches try to skip over this discernment phase and just go straight to sort of real estate transactions. And that is not particularly helpful way to start. We think it's really helpful to start with like grounding in who we are, what we're about, what ideas are, what our theological commitments are, who our neighborhood is, what do we want to see, what does flourishing look like, and going from there. And then the other technical stuff works itself out after those other parts are clear.
Yeah, that's a good word. Whether it's something as big as property development or as little as like starting a new ministry, like really knowing, like, does this flow out of who we are and what we want to be? That's a good reminder. So let's do last question here before we take a break. I wonder, like, do you have like a nightmare scenario where you wake up in 2030 and you're like, oh my goodness, this has come to pass? Like, or do you have, and then conversely, what's your dream scenario, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think the nightmare scenario I've sort of hinted at, which is, 20 years from now, we have like 40% less socially oriented property, church property, and so on. That's now no longer being used for the community in any way, but is privately owned. That's been monetized for private purposes, and is never accessible again. I mean, one of the folks that wrote a chapter in Gone for Good walks by regularly the location where he was ordained as a pastor, but that location is now simply a high-rise, high-end condo building that he can't even get into. And nothing happens there besides a few wealthy people living there. And again, there's nothing wrong with people living somewhere, but that's a shame when if that happens to all these properties, to me, that's the worst case scenario. If it happens to a few of them, fine. But of all of them, that would be a real shame. I think the best case is it's not that, right? It's buildings and land that are housing people that need places to live and feeding people through grocery co-ops and engaging people through community centers and restoring people through land back and inspiring people through social entrepreneurship. It's being the church with our buildings and land, right? It's like doing the things that the church can do, and joining in with communities and with restorative, justice-oriented, life-giving activity, and living the good news out with our buildings and land. And I think that actually can also happen. That's the other possible place we end up. I'm hoping it's more of the latter than the former.
Yeah, I watch a lot of like urban planning type YouTubes, and people who don't come across as like real devoted to the church. Even they like mention like what a loss it is when an old historic church is torn down or just turned into condos. Like people even in the community who may not be a part of a weekly attender recognize the value that these spaces are. So I'm with you.
Yep.
I'm hoping for something more positive here. Let's take a break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Mark Elsdon. Mark, thanks so much for your time. The book is, again, Gone for Good. Should be available wherever books are sold, so check it out. Mark, you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to. Although, I don't know if people would be cool if you answered about selling the Vatican for condos. So if you're Pope for a day, besides selling the Vatican for condos, what would you do?
Yeah, if I was Pope for the day, well, I assume you mean if I had the ability to influence the church at a scale like that. Yeah, I'll answer it fairly sort of technically because this is my area, I guess, and keep it in this space. So my previous book, which we talked about a couple of years ago on this podcast, We Aren't Broke, is focused on church investment money mostly. So I did have a chapter in there about property, but mostly it was about investment money, savings, and my real dream would be to see both these pieces come together. So putting church investment money, taking it out of the stock market and out of traditional investments, at least some of it, and moving it into investing in social enterprise and development on church property.
Yeah.
And bringing those two powerhouses together, it's literally trillions of dollars around the world of assets, both property assets and investment assets. And putting them together to work for mission-oriented social enterprise activity is just super exciting to me. So it's maybe not funny, but it is it is a dream that I have. If I had the opportunity to say, let's do this. Let's do this. We've got what we need. We have everything there. Let's just get on and do some cool stuff with it.
Yeah, absolutely. You really got the spirit of the question. So good job there. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's actually not something I think about very often, to be totally honest with you. But I did think about it when you shared this question with me. That I'd love to meet this guy, Saint Cuthbert. He's a 7th century saint from northern England and near the Scottish border, what is now the Scottish border. And in part because there's a connection to my family name that came out of a church where St. Cuthbert's body lay at some point many centuries ago. But also he was the most remarkable person. He lived on this tiny island called Lindisfarne, Holy Island, off of the east coast of England. And then that island that's so tiny was too big for him. So he moved to a tinier island off of that island and lived by himself amongst the birds. And he's just got some amazing stories. This is way back 7th century Christianity, some of the earliest European Christianity that existed. So I just think it'd be really interesting to talk with somebody like that. I have no idea what they would think of any of what we have discussed today, but it'd be fascinating.
Yeah. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Well, again, in the theme that we're at right today, I think we're at a real key inflection point in American Christianity, at least.
Yeah.
I'm different elsewhere in the world, but we're living through not just an incremental shift, but a major shift in the way people engage their faith. I mean, as we read any of the sort of information coming out of any of the studies around this is a huge moment in what Christianity is going to look like in the United States. And it has implications all over the place. And so I don't know what that, I mean, there's a sense of responsibility, a bit of sense of awe, a bit of sense of fear, and also hopefully a sense of hope, because all of that's happening right now.
Well, let's stay on that theme then and frame it this way. What do you hope for at least American Christianity then?
Yeah, if it's okay, I'm gonna just read a few sentences from the book on that, because so I think that letting go of property can be freeing. Relinquishing control can be life-giving to others. Giving land back can be deeply healing, and redeveloping can be restorative. Repurposing church property is a chance to do something new. It allows us to think differently, to see more vividly, listen more deeply, and love more fully. It's an opportunity to take the good news outside the Sunday worship service. The transition of church property is one of the largest issues facing the church today. It is also one of our greatest opportunities. Yes, churches, buildings, and property will be gone. Of this, there is no doubt. But I'm incredibly hopeful that new and good things will emerge and that they will be gone for good.
That's good. Let's leave it there. So always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.